Well, good morning, everybody. We are the first Sunday in really a new era of the Presbyterian Church. We haven't talked a ton about inclusion here because every time I talk about it, people are sort of say, well, haven't we done that already? Or it's about time or whatever. So it's preaching to the choir in a lot of cases. But last week, the decision was finally made at General Assembly that we are an inclusive church of LGBTQi2 people. There was a caveat put in for freedom of conscience. So if there are people for whom this is theologically irreconcilable, they have the right to refuse. But officially, we are an inclusive church. The details will be forthcoming. This is public knowledge. There is the 7-hour sitting of that day's meeting available on YouTube if you've got 7 hours to kill on that. I do not myself. And I assume in the next week or so there will be a letter forthcoming from national office explaining what's happened and next steps. And there are next steps. There will be things happening in the near future. General Assembly for a lot of people can feel like this far off nebulous group, but it's actually not that far off. So I've been sent to General Assembly. Mary's been sent a couple of times. Basically the way that you guys interact with well, there's two ways that you interact with General Assembly. On the one hand, you, the congregation, elect a set of elders that make up the session, and each session from every church in the region sends one ruling elder and their teaching elder, i.e. their minister, to presbytery, and those people make up a committee called presbytery. We call it our communal bishop. So, the Anglicans and Catholics have bishops. We have a committee made up of 2 people from every church that makes up our bishop. And then General Assembly is a meeting of representatives from each of those presbyteries each year. And it's on a rotation. So it's just, when you join the presbytery, they put you on a list sort of at the bottom of the list, and we're always sort of circulating through that list. And that way, it's a different group every year. So that gives you a pretty good cross-section of what the denomination's feeling. And also, it prevents sort of politics surrounding who goes. There's no approval of the people that go. It's just, if you're free to travel and you're on the list that year, you go. And that's just how it's done. And so every year they make those decisions, and that's how you are represented. The other way that you're represented is the ideas discussed and the things discussed come from below. So we actually recently wrote an overture to General Assembly. It went to General Assembly this year, and it was asking for a more inclusive, modern vision of our subordinate standard living faith. And so we sat down and we wrote a letter, and it went to General Assembly, and they considered it. That's how we do it. And a lot of churches have written letters about inclusion. And if you want to know why we haven't written a letter about inclusion, it's basically because a lot of other churches have. So it just wasn't on our radar. But anyway, so that's General Assembly. Let's talk now about the traditional and the inclusive camps. We started talking about this really back in the 80s, but the general starting date was 1994, which was the first time this was discussed at General Assembly. I think there was an earlier report, but 1994 is sort of the main date that we use. And at that point, it was affirmed that being attracted to the same sex is not a choice. You're attracted to who you're attracted to, and you don't have a say in it. So that in itself can't be sinful. It's the way you're made. And there are people that will argue with that within our church, but that is not the church's stance. And then they reminded us that we are to love unconditionally, no matter what. We do not judge who comes through our doors. We love everybody. And thirdly, it said not yet. Yet being the operative word. It wanted to do more work. And when you think about the fact that this was happening in 1994, it's a completely different era. that's not surprising to me. I know it's disappointing to many. It's not surprising to me. I think that's just where we were at culturally. So, traditionally speaking, the idea is not that being gay is sinful in itself. You can ordain, you can put in leadership, you can do whatever with LGBTQI people. So it's not necessarily about including LGBTQI people. They should have always been included on paper. The crux was whether you were celibate or not. If you're LGBTQI and you are in a relationship, it's basically because we wouldn't marry you. That means it's sort of the equivalent of living with your partner before you're married, or being sexually active before you're married, or anything like that. And that's something that, especially in the Presbyterian Church, we don't talk about very much, because it's something we don't want to talk about, because it's changing. How many people have lived together before they're married, or have kids or grandkids that do that, and for the right reasons. That whole discussion is changing. And so the idea, when I've talked to people about it on the traditional side, and let's be clear, on the traditional side, there's a group of people that are homophobic and are just looking for support of their homophobia. But there's other people that are saying, I gotta stick with the Bible, and this is what I see, but it doesn't stop me from loving you. And at the end of the day, we're all sinful. That's Reformed Theology 101, is that we all sin. It's unavoidable. Half the time we don't even know when we're doing it. And so that's sort of how traditionally we've gotten around it. But the problem is, how do you really welcome someone for whom their desire for family, for whom we can't approve their desire for family? I think that's particularly poignant in the church, because we've almost idealized or idolized family. There's this idea in the church that a man and a woman and a couple of kids is sort of the perfect unit, and the right way to be. And when we talk to single people, too often, oh, well, you'll find someone. Well, maybe they just want to be single, or people without kids, like, oh, what's wrong with them? It's we hold up this ideal, we idolize the church, or the idolize family, and I think that's a conversation that needs to be had if we're truly inclusive. And then we say to LGBTQi2 people, you can't have that. That's the crux for me. That's the really problematic part for me, and it always has been. Now, the inclusive side would say, well, the Bible, when the Bible talks about LGBTQi2 relationships, it's either we discount it, or we sort of add some culture into that and sort of say, well, it's not really talking about the same thing. There's not actually that many references to homosexuality in the Bible. There's enough. But when you consider how big of a book it is and how little it says on it, that's a difference. But also, when you look at it, from my perspective anyway, whenever it mentions homosexuality, it's talking about a very specific kind of sort of depraved sexuality. In the example, and I picked the example from Corinthians today on purpose. I am cherry picking because it's an easy argument to make. It's a little harder with some of the others. It speaks very clearly against homosexuality. But when you look at the Greek word that it uses for homosexuality, it's porneo. Sorry for the Greek people out there. My pronunciation's terrible. But that means male prostitute. And not only that, but it has some really weird power dynamic stuff very unsavory, unhealthy relationship kind of stuff implied. And so, we got asked that question, is, two women adopting a kid and having a house in the suburbs the same thing as a male prostitute in the first century that is somehow beholden to someone else? That's not the same thing at all. Really the only thing in common with the two is that they're same sex. The other thing is recognizing that, of course, the Bible is going to be uncomfortable with homosexuality, because in that era, two people didn't have to love each other to be married. It was a different, marriage was a different thing than what we talk about today. It was for joining families, business, politics. Wives were chattel. It was not what we're talking about today. And the Bible's so big on having kids because, for half of it, it's talking about Israel, which was trying to become a nation. So of course kids were important, and it was your social safety net. So, the inclusive side would say this isn't talking about the same thing. There's not really anything commenting on this. So why are we being exclusive? Now, I want to be clear that there is a lot of, in my opinion, there is a lot of proof texting going on in the traditional argument. I know a bunch of people that are traditionalists that just say, what, I'm not comfortable putting these cultural extrapolations on the Bible. I need to have a closer reading of it. And they're perfectly loving, supportive people that are trying to reconcile this together and genuinely trying to do it. I also know a lot of people that are just have homophobic opinions and are looking for Bible verses to back it up. We got to be honest about this is part of the conversation. I think the other thing that we've got to be honest about the fact is what LGBTQi2 people have gone through recently and historically. There is a certain sexual slur for gay people that refers to a package of twigs to be thrown on the fire. And that's a reference to the fact that at one point homosexuals were burned at the stake. We have tortured and killed homosexual people in our tradition. Not for a long time in sort of that respect, but that is in our history. More recently, people have committed suicide because their churches and their families won't accept them. We have excluded them from culture because up until fairly recently, churches have had sort of guidance and control over the culture. And we've said that homosexuality is not okay. And so we've pushed homosexual people out of the culture to either form their own or be alone. And people have gone through tremendous mental health issues over that, including suicide. Homosexuals have received abuse, both verbal and physical. They've been discriminated against. It's pretty bad. And I think we need to be very honest about this. General Assembly, actually it was the year that I was at General Assembly, we voted to do a thing called the Rainbow Communion, and this was a listening group. Their job was to go out and find LGBTQi2 people in the church and just listen to their experiences. That's something we all need to do. It's tough. It's tough what people have gone through. And I think for me, the real shame of this whole conversation is that over here are people who are being excluded from the gospel community, who really need the gospel community, and I don't think are doing anything wrong. And over here, we're having an argument about the finer points of theology. That's a problem. Now, I want to come back. I said earlier that I want to emphasize respect. And I do this a little uncomfortably, because to me, trying to find common ground in a divided church over sexuality, when the headline needs to be, hey, we've just accepted these people that have not been accepted forever and have really suffered for it, that seems disingenuous. But I think if we're going to go ahead and move ahead and do what we need to do, we do need to have a sense of respect. We need to recognize that for people like me, of course, we would be inclusive. Why would we not be? And for me, it's a problem that we would be exclusive. It seems against the gospel that we would be exclusive along sexuality lines. But at the same time, there are people that are reading their Bibles and going, but it says right here, and I've committed my life to trying to follow this book that I think is full of wisdom, and this doesn't compute either. And both sides are being asked to do something that they feel is unbiblical and unchristian. And yes, there's homophobia, and on the other side, it seems a lot less threatening, but on the other side, there's people that just include everything. Everything's on a spectrum, right? So both extremes have problems. But, we've just upset about half of the church. I'm not sure whether that was I think it was a 60-40. I think it needed more than a simple majority to pass. But don't quote me on that. But it was close. And it's something that we've been arguing about for years. Now, a bunch of people that voted against inclusion, they were just worried about they were for inclusion, but not yet, because they didn't want to divide the church. So I don't think it's clear how many people are upset right now. But there was a losing side to this argument. This was not a unanimous decision. And it was immediately after that, the inclusion debate decision was made, that gracious dismissal was put forward. And gracious dismissal is basically allowing people to leave the denomination and whole congregations graciously who have a problem with this decision. And, that's a bird's nest that we now have to untangle. I'm not sure that that's unhealthy. This LGBTQi2 inclusion debate, in my opinion, it's not about LGBTQi2 inclusion. It's about how we read the Bible. It's about theology. And when you look at it on that terms, we have had two solitudes within the same denomination for a long time now. And a decisive battle has just been fought between these two sides. And the question is, are we going to continue to exist together as partners, or are we going to continue to exist as neighbors? What is going to be healthier? Over the coming years, even weeks, months, years, there's going to be Presbyterians, congregations that leave the denomination. I don't know how we're going to fare. I don't think we'll be untouched, but I think we'll be in better shape than others. But even for congregations like us that are fairly unified in their support of inclusion, there's going to be ramifications. The neighboring churches are going to have ramifications. I think we're probably going to lose one or two churches from our presbytery, and that either means that the presbytery is going to have to find another interim moderator for a now decimated congregation, and that's going to be one of the ministers, or we're going to have to put together, committees to figure out how to either relocate congregations or sell buildings or something. These conversations are coming. There's also conversations about the legality of this freedom of conscience. Basically, as I understand it, when the denomination says inclusion's okay, even though we've given the freedom of conscience, that opens the door for discrimination lawsuits. It sounds like there's a way around that. We wouldn't have gone into this decision uneducated, but that is now something that the rubber hits the road, and we've got to make that work. It just kind of goes on and on. This will be something that we feel. My hope, one, is that now we can finally phone our friends that are LGBTQi2 and say, welcome, truly welcome, in a way that we struggled with before. But the other is that these two sides of the church, I hope, finally get to be themselves. I don't think a division in this case is necessarily unhealthy. It will be hard to deal with in the short term, but I think it allows us to be more authentically ourselves, and I'm excited for that. So, this is an interesting time. On the one hand, I'm excited. On the other hand, I'm a little fearful. And on the other hand, to me, this is great news, but it's kind of late to the game. It's a big time. But I think when I think about our faith, our faith is designed to be dynamic. We wouldn't need grace if it was clear the way forward. We wouldn't need the Holy Spirit if we could always tell the way forward. And so this kind of discomfort, this kind of change, this is kind of what we're about. We're always supposed to be going, all right, let's take some readings and ask, what is God trying to tell us in this situation? And, we've made a big step. And we'll have to talk more. So when we're back in person, I'm hoping to have sort of we've got to talk more with the session, but I'm hoping to sort of just have a general conversation about it at some point. We do need to talk about just what the implications might be, not just for us, but as part of an ecosystem with surrounding congregations that might be affected more than us. We might need to talk about ways that we can announce this to our LGBTQi2 friends. We may need to figure out ways to say goodbye to congregants we know and love. It's not easy, but it's change, and we're reformed, and we're always reforming. Amen.